I'm Heidi Przbyla.
And I'm Mark Halperin. With all due respect to Hillary Clinton's staffers, you missed an awesome opportunity for Ring Around the Rosie. On the show tonight, Hillary's rope and Christie's hope. But first, the Donald says nope. 883 words just hit our inbox shortly before we went on the air. A feature story-length statement from the Donald, an unusual one, about his now famous comments about Mexican immigrants that he made on the day he announced he was running for president. Trump's statement simultaneously stands by what he said, but sounds, for him, uncharacteristically defensive in trying to justify his remarks. You can read the whole statement on our website. Trump's statement has become the dominant matter in Republican presidential politics of late. Every Republican presidential candidate has been asked to comment on Trump's original statement. So how to respond? One school of thought says, show some sympathy for the man.
I salute Donald Trump for focusing on the need to address illegal immigration. The Washington cartel doesn't want to address that. He has a colorful way of speaking. It's not the way I speak, but I'm not going to engage in the media's game of throwing rocks and attacking other Republicans. I'm just not going to do it.
So Ted Cruz and Rick Santorum showing some sympathy for Trump, not going after him. On the other end of the spectrum, there's another school of thought that says hit him hard.
This is a guy who was a Democrat for most of the last decade. I don't think he represents the Republican Party, and his views are way out of the mainstream of what Republicans think. He's not a stupid guy, so I don't assume he's like, he thinks that every Mexican crossing the border is a rapist. I mean, so he's doing this to inflame and to incite and to draw attention, which seems to be his organizing principle of his campaign.
I've said very clearly that Donald Trump does not represent the Republican Party. I was offended by his remarks. He's going to have to defend those remarks. I never will.
By the way, after Jeb Bush made those comments, Trump wrote on Twitter that Jeb Bush likes, quote, Mexican illegals because of his wife. That tweet was later deleted. And, of course, there's another way to respond somewhat in the middle. Christie and others who basically have said Trump is a good guy who said a bad thing. So, Heidi, all the Republicans are responding in different ways. What is the best way, not just in this case, but in general, to deal with the controversial Mr. Trump?
The best way they had all hoped to deal with him was to just kind of ignore him. He's the reality star, you know, with the funny hair that they all just kind of wanted to ignore. But what this shows is they can't ignore him, especially when he's making comments that many view as inflammatory.
And bad for the party.
And bad for the party.
No way to ignore Donald Trump. And the reality is, this is why people doubted he'd ever run, because he's a different breed, and people are going to talk about him. And if he says controversial things, as long as he's on the stage, they're going to have to answer.
I would add, Mark, that I think that they really took too long, though, to respond to this. They're going to have to take this as a lesson. They took 12 days to respond to these comments. In the future, they're going to have to be on it. They're going to have to do their research, and they're going to have to be prepared for these hits.
Mitt Romney, who took Trump's endorsement in a high-profile way 4 years ago, also criticized Trump. I want to see if somebody comes out and hits him harder and says he doesn't belong in this race. I'm not saying they're going to do it, but at some point, because Trump's tendency is to go after people who go after him, at some point somebody's going to face a real face-off with Donald Trump. It's going to be quite a moment.
From Gotham to Gorham, New Hampshire, that is, where Hillary Clinton marched in the 4th of July parade and her press corps was strung along by campaign aides holding ropes to keep them contained like common bovine creatures. Today, Clinton's campaign tried to get back on the press's good side by saying she'd do an interview with CNN tomorrow, her first national interview since announcing her candidacy. Mark, though, the rope pen, good idea, bad idea?
I'm going to take as much heat as Hillary Clinton did for this. It was purely logistical. There was a parade. They didn't want to have the press preset, so they'd miss the whole parade. They didn't have a truck to ride with her. They were ruining the parade by running around, and this was a way to keep them contained and moving forward. It looks horrible, but it was purely logistics. I think the Clinton campaign is getting a hugely bum rap for this.
Mark, given the history here, they had to see this coming. It was stupid to do this, especially given the Clinton administration, the previous administration, as well as Hillary Clinton's own reputation with the press as being kind of paranoid with the press and having kind of this brass knuckles approach to dealing with the media.
But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to say that because she's got a bad relationship with the press, everything feeds into that image. The reality is they did this for logistical purposes. The press swarms all over her. There's security concerns. But again, think about the parade. If they had let the press go wherever the press wanted to go, we're penned in all the time.
They're just going to have to be a little bit more sensitive, though, I think, to that history going forward.
I agree.
It's like following reporters to the bathroom.
I agree. It doesn't look. I agree. It doesn't look good, and that stuff doesn't look good. And there's a special onus on her. But all I'm saying is, in this case, I don't think their motives were anything but to try to have the event not be ruined, and they pay a price because of who she is. I agree with that.
And certainly they're trying to do more in terms of accessibility and some of the other elements that they've been hit on in terms of their bad relations with the media. So they, I think, are on it, and they'll try to move forward in a positive way. Big interview tomorrow.
We'll see what she gets asked and what she says. Christie made the media rounds himself, both yesterday and over the weekend. CBS This Morning. He was on Fox News twice, and he did Morning Joe on MSNBC. He went out of his way to name-check some of his rivals in a negative way, including Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, and he took what appeared to be a veiled shot at Scott Walker.
I'm a guy who has actually dealt with the Democratic legislature for the last 6 years and gotten things done. It's much more like what it'll be in Washington, D.C. for the next president than if you're a Republican governor with a Republican legislature where you send things down the hall, they stamp it and send it back. What the American people need to know is that Senator Paul's conduct has made them weaker and more vulnerable to attack. And that's why what Rand Paul has done to make this country weaker and more vulnerable is a terrible thing. And for him to raise money off of it is disgraceful. I find it ironic, right, that Ted Cruz is giving lectures on Republican violence. All due respect, I don't need to be lectured by Ted Cruz.
So, Heidi, you got the best political brawler in the Republican Party calling out his rivals. You have some Republicans donors, the AP is reporting, uncomfortable with the attacks. Is this smart for him to start going after people by name, pretty much except for Trump, before anybody else? It's
not just smart. It's kind of his only option at this point. We're talking about a guy who went from being really a prohibitive front runner to now near the bottom of the pack. It's so much so that he may not even qualify for the debate. So what does he do to draw attention to himself? He starts throwing punches in every direction. He's not just throwing them at Jeb, another prohibitive frontrunner potentially, but also at folks like Ted Cruz. It's kind of, also in keeping with his style as being a little bit scrappy a fighter, so it plays into that as well.
The other smart thing about it, not in every case, but in most cases, he's going after people on things he believes about and saying things with passion. They're not gratuitous shots. He actually has differences with these guys on some of these issues, and he's defending himself. Cruz, criticized people for criticizing Trump, and Christie points out that Cruz has had his own problem going after Republicans. So I think it is smart because he's speaking from the heart, and when Christie speaks from the heart, he's at his best. All right. In fact, the two biggest political stories on the planet right now are happening not here but overseas. We're going to get you excited about talking about Greece and Iran right after this. The deadline on the Iran nuclear talks is approaching fast, and our colleague in Vienna at the talks, Bloomberg Foreign Policy correspondent Indira Lakshmanan, is here now to give us the very latest. Indira.
So in the building behind me, the Coburg Palace, we have the foreign ministers from the 6 major powers, including the U.S., Russia, China, and their European partners, negotiating into the night with Iran. Now, we know that after dinner, they're planning to restart negotiations at 9 p.m., expected to go till 3 a.m. or longer, the same thing we saw in Switzerland in the efforts they had to get an interim deal. So at this point, this is not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination. John Kerry has said very strongly this could still go either way, and if it fails, then we're in unknown territory because no foreign ministers here are talking about another extension. So if you want to know what the major sticking points are that remain, I think on the Iranian side, they really want sanctions relief to come faster. And on the American side, they want to delay the lifting of a UN arms embargo, and they want to make sure they get really broad access for UN atomic inspectors to make sure that Iran never cheats over the life of this deal. So that brings us to the question of if they get the deal, then what happens? And I think in Washington, it's going to be an incredibly hard lift for them to try to sell this deal in Congress. So their work is not done, even if they end up getting this deal by tomorrow night. Back to you, Mark and Heidi.
And Indira, thanks. Joining us now, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. Richard, thank you for coming in. Skeptics of this deal, people who are open to supporting it but skeptical. Richard, Dennis Ross and the other people, former officials who signed that letter, some people on Capitol Hill. If you're a skeptic, based on what's come out about what's in play, what are you worried about now? What are you looking at? What are the one or two things to say, this has to come through or I can't support this?
Probably the biggest thing for most skeptics is the question of inspections. What kind of delays you'd have to have, what sort of access to what kind of sites. A little bit of concern about too much sanctions relief too soon that takes the pressure off Iran. So I think that's the principal concern of most skeptics. My own concern is actually less that. I think while you will have compliance issues, I'm actually more concerned about what happens if Iran complies. 10 years from now, they can do whatever they want with centrifuges, 15 years with uranium, and all because of that, we're going to face a daily problem with many of its neighbors. So managing this is now going to become a permanent challenge to American foreign policy.
So to that point, if the U.S. feels that the deal actually isn't quite there, could it face pressure anyway from its negotiating partners to go ahead and sign on to it, and then what happens?
Sure. If things break down, I think the most important thing is at this point, whether you like the deal or not, you don't want the breakdown to be perceived because the United States has moved the goalposts. It's one thing if the Iranian government suddenly says you can't have the inspections that reasonable people would say are essential. So failure is not the problem. It's really, on whose fault is it widely perceived to be? And if it's us, then it seems to me sanctions unravel. And that's the worst of all outcomes. No deal, no sanctions.
Does Iran have a strong hand at this point in the endgame of the negotiations?
Sure.
What's the source of the strength for them?
Well, you've got your China and Russia that are fairly sympathetic. You've got a United States government that clearly doesn't want things to fail, do not want to have to face military force. So each side is in some ways limited by what it doesn't want. What keeps the Iranians in the game is obviously their desire and political need, particularly President Rouhani, for sanctions relief because of the economic bonus that would accrue to the Iranian government.
Right. Let's switch over to the other big story of the day, which is Greece. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Let's say, worst case, Greece does leave the euro and maybe leaves the European Union. What are the implications of that if that happens?
In some ways, probably less than certain people think. It highlights some of the structural problems that Europe got ahead of itself politically and the economics was lagging behind. For the Germans and others, it might even be salutary in some ways. They're much more worried about the precedent that compromise could set rather than contagion. The fear about the Russians stepping in, I don't think so. Russia doesn't really offer an economic alternative to Greece. The real problem is economics, whether this weakens the fabric not just of Europe but the rest of the world economy.
Right.
And do you think that this referendum vote could also have a little bit of politics at play in terms of the Greeks trying to just get a better bailout deal?
About 100%. This is, I don't know the word for chicken in Greece, but that's what this is. And this is a way for the government to say, look, it's not just us, it's the Greek people. Now, what they don't point out is the wording of the resolution. If they had worded it in saying, do you want to stay in Europe, 60% of the Greek people would have said yes. Instead, you had this convoluted thing about supporting austerity. Well, of course you got a no vote. So this is simply built to strengthen their bargaining position. They're still hoping that the Germans and the Europeans blink. I'm not so sure it's going to happen. I think the real problem also over the next few days with the banks closed now is how do you keep people alive? And that means it seems to me either the Greek government issues some kind of scrip, almost a new drachma, or the Europeans say, apart from a new loan, we'll give you some money just for humanitarian reasons, just to tide you over for a couple of days, but that's it. I think that's kind of where we are.
Chancellor Merkel's obviously a huge player here. Outside of Greece and Merkel, who are the huge players now that will define how this goes forward?
Well, they are the principal ones. It's not the United States, interestingly enough. The IMF, Christine Lagarde, has a role. The French government probably after the German government. The odd thing, though, about the French government is one of the reasons the German government is hanging so tough. It's because of its concern about Southern Europe. France is not at the beginning of that line. It's Spain coming up, Portugal, and others. But France is at the end of that line. The most important country, ultimately, of Southern Europe after Italy is France. And that's what the Germans are worried about.
In the end, does this matter? Does the resolution of this matter a lot? A little?
Probably less than people think. I'd be now, for example, at least as worried about the Chinese economy. Stock market there is down 30% over the last couple of days. No, I don't think this is. When we're done with the year, I don't think this is going to be the central story by any means.
Do you think that U.S. deficit hawks, understanding that the situations are very, very different, but given the dialogue going on here in the U.S., are going to draw any parallels, any lessons here?
Alas, not. And when you think about why do we have our deficit and why, and ultimately the debt going up, more than anything else, it's entitlements. They're still off the board. The sequester deals with lots of things, unfortunately. It doesn't deal with entitlements. Plus, sooner or later, when rates go up, that's going to exacerbate our problem with the deficit and the debt. But at the moment, that's in the too difficult to talk about box in American politics, which is too bad. Because sometime during the next presidency, some of these issues, as the baby boomers begin to retire and their health care needs go up, probably by around 2020, 2021, these issues are really going to come to the fore.
We have to do the rapid round, which is big at the Council on Foreign Relations. Iran deal, yes or no?
Yes.
Wow. And Greek stays in, yes or no?
In the long run, yes.
Long run stays in. All right. Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, thank you very much. We'll be right back with a Romney. The spanking new Washington Post profile, Scott Walker's wife, Jeanette, talks about some family tension between the Wisconsin governor and his sons. That story reminded us of a recent conversation I had with Mitt Romney's eldest son, Tag, at his father's recent summit in Park City, Utah. We talked about what it was like to have a father run for president twice.
It was a wonderful experience. It was a huge privilege to be able to do that, and didn't mean it was easy the whole time. There were high points and low points, and it was challenging, and I think you always take things more personally as family of the candidate than you do as the candidate. But yeah, it was a fantastic experience. We're very lucky to have it.
We often talk about how when someone runs the second time, they're better. Your dad was a better candidate the second time than the first time. What was easier for the family the second time?
I'm not sure there was anything. The first time you run, it was kind of exciting, and people talked to you. I remember people came and talked to us about it. You're going to go through this thing called the freak show. We didn't know what that meant, and we were excited about it. And then by the end of it, we were a little
less excited about the freak show. Yeah.
But then the second time through, you knew right from the start what it was going to be, and so you're geared up a little bit more for
nothing you learned from the first time that you were able to apply the second time?
Well, yeah, you just, I think, thicker skin. So as a result, you weren't quite as let down because this is what it's going to be, and it's part of the process, and you just develop a little bit thicker skin.
Right. So this cycle, 16 candidates. Some of them have kids.
I thought there were a lot more than 16. Is it only 16?
It's a rough. I'm rounding to the closest 16. Some of them have kids who are a little bit older. Most of them are somewhat younger than you, but still adults. What advice have you given, or would you give to those families with the kids who are teenagers and above?
I've spoken to a few of them. Some of them reached out and said, "What advice do you have?" And it's really hard until you've gone through it yourself to really understand. But my advice is just enjoy it. Be yourself. Don't be afraid to speak out when you have an opinion. Don't let the consultants or the experts shame you into being quiet, and try to stand up for your parent, because you know them better than anyone else does.
Consultants really do that?
Sometimes. Not that my dad's did, but I know others have. Yeah.
One of the most sort of heartwarming things I've seen the whole cycle so far was at Ted Cruz's announcements. His two little girls, who both Ted Cruz and his wife were kind of concerned how would they react to being in this big crowd situation. They came out on the stage afterwards and they were waving, and they seemed pretty into it.
Yeah.
And both Ted Cruz and his wife had said that was kind of cool.
You can get used to anything. I mean, it becomes the new normal, and it's okay. And so I think they'll be fine.
Your dad is staying neutral in the race, it seems, for a while. Are you doing the same thing?
I am. My plan is to wholeheartedly support whoever the nominee is and try to help the Republicans win back the White House. But we'll let the process play itself out and see who the voters want to select.
You're in business now. There's been talk, I don't know how serious, at times, about your running for public office here or in Massachusetts. Is that something you're open to, or have you ruled it out?
I've ruled it out. For a long time I thought I might, but watching the process, I don't want to put my kids through it. I'm ruling it out for the next 15 years at least.
Okay,
so I'll let my kids grow up and get out of the house. How old will you be in 15 years? I'll be 60.
Plenty of time to run. So, again, I don't want to overanalyze it, or I don't mean this in a critical way, but you're someone who's interested in public service. You did think about it, as you just said, for a time, and yet what you're saying is, I think what you're saying is you don't want to put your kids through the toughness of it. Isn't that a little bit discouraging for the country, that people basically, someone who's seen it up close and personal is now saying, I don't want my kids to go through what I went through?
It is. I have worried about this for a while. There are a lot of really good people who I would love to see run for office, and who don't want to do it. And I don't know what the answer is, how to change that, but it is certainly a problem.
So your grandfather obviously served in public office, your father's father, and your dad did. So is the family business of politics going to die with your generation?
Josh, my brother Josh.
Josh, what can we get him to run for?
You know, I am encouraging him to run for governor in Utah.
Of which state? Of
Utah, yeah. So that's a little ways off, but eventually I think he
And is he going to require a lot of convincing?
I don't think he will. No, I think,
I think he's gung-ho.
He's more eager than I am.
What'd be a good slogan for Josh's gubernatorial campaign?
I'm Tag's younger brother.
That's big in Utah.
That's big in Utah, yeah.
Last thing is you've seen now for all the scrutiny in campaigns, the Clintons and the Bushes and the Obamas all have been pretty successful in shielding their daughters, all of them have daughters, from public scrutiny. Is there some lesson in that? Is it possible that in the campaign context, people could make the trade? Basically what they've said at the White House, and the White House is, we're not going to put our kids out very much front and center, and therefore please shield them from scrutiny. Could a candidate say that? Say, my kids aren't going to campaign, they're not going to be front and center, but we'd ask in return you not scrutinize
I think so. I mean, my daughter was on the campaign trail last time. She was 16, but she stayed off the camera, and we asked the camera to stay off of her.
And it worked.
And it worked. So I think it's possible. If the candidate makes a priority, I think it's possible.
All right. Tag Romney, thanks very much. Appreciate it. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
So Tag Romney and his brothers, have, for the most part, have become kind of professional as being offspring of presidential candidates. We mentioned before Scott Walker's two sons, and his wife seem to suggest in the Washington Post story that they're a little bit more inclined towards same-sex marriage than Scott Walker is, for sure. How big a deal in this field with lots of first-time candidates, lots of younger kids, do you think this issue is going to be of spouses or kids being different on some issues than their candidate relative?
I don't think it's a big deal in that I don't think it really hurts or is a surprise to anyone that members of families have different opinions. Who doesn't have a family member with a different opinion? In some ways, it makes the candidate even more relatable in that sense. And on this specific issue, it's not going to hurt Scott Walker with evangelicals that his wife or his son may have a different opinion, and it may even help him with younger voters if he should make it to a general election.
I think you're right. On balance, it probably can help, but you do see some conservatives reacting to the Washington Post story and saying, well, wait a minute, if Scott Walker's getting all this pressure at home, right after he said there should be a constitutional amendment turning it back to the states, he gave a speech out in Colorado and didn't talk about same-sex marriage in a way that some conservatives seized on. So I think it sort of depends on how you handled it. You saw Laura Bush sometimes take a different position than her husband on a few issues, but in this nomination fight, when there's so much pressure, so much competition, I think if you handle it wrong, it can be a big problem, particularly with these younger kids who aren't experiencing the national spotlight.
Yes, the ebb and flow of the campaign, the things that you're citing. At the end of the day, Scott Walker's position is what it is, and conservatives may be watching this nuance closely, but if he becomes the candidate for the party's nominee, I think that this will all come out in the wash.
Yeah, and if he says, my views are my views, and as he said, who agrees with their family on everything, I think it's fine, but under pressure, sometimes people don't handle it perfectly. All right, we'll be right back. We're always on BloombergPolitics.com. Our colleague Steve Yacino has a great piece about the debates on the Republican side. Remember, this program is on twice a day at 5 and at 8. We'll be back here tomorrow. Big political news day, more on Iran, of course, but also Hillary Clinton's first big interview. We'll talk about it all right here on With All Due Respect. Until then, for Heidi and me, we say sayonara.